They threw the veteran Navy SEAL out of his grandfather's land with nothing left but an old truck and a war dog. 20 years later, his German shepherd suddenly leads him back to the forest everyone thought he had lost forever. Deep beneath Whitlock Ridge, an old secret buried by his grandfather has been waiting all this time. Now Rowan Whitlock must face the family that erased him and the land that never forgot his name. Because sometimes God hides miracles in the quiet loyalty of a single dog. And sometimes the road home begins with the soul brave enough to return. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and like and subscribe to Hollow Point K9. The autumn light in Black Alder County always looked unreal in late October, as if someone had poured watered honey across the tops of the pine trees and let it drip slowly through the valleys. Rowan Mercer had forgotten that, or maybe he had spent 20 years trying to forget it on purpose. The old Ford truck rattled along the narrow county road, tires crunching over loose gravel while cold wind hissed through a crack in the driver's side window. Pines stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, tall and dark and patient. Morning mist still clung low near the creek beds, turning the forest silver in places where sunlight broke through. Rowan drove with one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel. The other occasionally dropped toward the German shepherd lying across the passenger seat. Atlas lifted his head when Rowan touched him. The dog was around 6 years old now, a black and tan canine with a disciplined, muscular frame that still carried traces of military sharpness even in rest. His coat was short and dense, black across the back like worn armor, fading into deep golden fur along his chest and legs. His eyes were the thing people remembered most, focused, intelligent, always studying the room before entering it fully. Atlas never truly relaxed. Dogs like him were not built for that. Neither were men like Rowan. At 43, Rowan still looked like the kind of man people instinctively moved aside for in hardware stores and gas stations. He stood just over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the compact strength of someone shaped by years of military conditioning rather than gym mirrors. His face was hard-edged and weathered, with a square jaw hidden beneath rough stubble and deep blue-gray eyes that rarely stopped scanning their surroundings. Early silver streaked the dark hair above his temples, cut short in the practical military style he had never bothered changing after retirement. He wore the same thing he always wore, an olive-green field jacket faded at the elbows, a red and dark blue flannel shirt underneath, dark cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and an old military watch scratched from years of use. The truck hit a pothole. Atlas shifted carefully and let out the faintest grunt. "You all right?" Rowan asked quietly. Atlas looked at him once, then lowered his head again. The limp had started 3 weeks earlier somewhere in Montana. At first, Rowan thought it was stiffness from age or cold weather, but the dog had begun favoring the leg more each day, especially in the mornings. The nearest decent veterinary clinic happened to be in Black Alder County, of all places. Rowan had almost laughed when he saw the sign on the map. Black Alder County, population 3,102. Welcome home. Home. The word had never sat right in his chest. Not after Elias died. Not after the county home, not after Afghanistan, especially not after Afghanistan. A logging truck roared past in the opposite direction, snapping Rowan back into the present. Atlas immediately lifted his head, ears alert, eyes tracking the sound until it disappeared into the forest. "Easy," Rowan murmured. The dog settled again. Black Alder appeared gradually through the trees like a memory that had been waiting patiently to be remembered. The old gas station still leaned slightly to one side, mailboxes stood crooked along dirt roads, rusted pickups sat outside weathered homes with stacks of chopped firewood beside them. Nothing changed quickly here. That was both the beauty and the curse of places like this. The veterinary clinic occupied a low, white building beside the highway. Rowan parked, helped Atlas down carefully, and walked him inside. An hour later, the veterinarian, a short, middle-aged woman with tired eyes and silver blonde hair tied into a loose bun, told him the injury wasn't severe. "Ligament strain," she said. "He's compensating too much on uneven ground." "Can he still travel?" "He can," she replied, kneeling to scratch Atlas gently behind the ear. "But not forever without rest. Dogs like him don't know when to stop." Rowan almost smiled at that. Neither did soldiers. By the time they left the clinic, evening shadows had begun stretching across town. Rowan rented the cheapest motel room he could find and walked Atlas slowly along the edge of Main Street. That was when the memories really started coming back. The diner still stood at the far end of town beneath an old flickering neon sign that buzzed softly in the cold air. Frost gathered at the corners of the windows. Inside, warm yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk. Atlas stopped walking. Rowan noticed immediately. The dog stood perfectly still, ears forward. "What is it?" Atlas sniffed the air once, then again. Something in the dog's posture changed. Not fear, not aggression. Recognition. Rowan felt tension tighten quietly beneath his ribs. The diner smelled exactly the same when he pushed open the door. Coffee, bacon grease, old wood, wet wool jackets drying near heaters, and underneath it all, cedar oil. The kind Elias used on rifle stocks every winter. The kind Rowan had not smelled in 20 years. A waitress in her 60s glanced up from behind the counter. Her name tag read, Mary Lou. She had soft features, pale skin lined gently by age, and tired brown eyes that somehow still carried warmth. "Well," she said with a smile, "haven't seen you around before." Rowan nodded once. "Just passing through." Atlas stayed close beside him as they moved toward a booth near the wall. Several old men sat drinking coffee near the windows, all wearing flannel jackets and seed company caps. One of them glanced toward Rowan and froze slightly. The old man was lean and weathered, with deeply lined skin and a white beard trimmed close to the jaw. His shoulders stooped with age, but his pale eyes remained sharp beneath the brim of a dark cap. He kept staring. Not rudely, like someone looking at a ghost. Rowan ignored it at first. Then Atlas stood. The dog moved away from the booth slowly, nose working the air with increasing focus. "Atlas?" No response. The German shepherd crossed the diner floor directly toward the far wall where an old county map hung beside a rack of postcards. Several people turned to watch. Atlas stopped beneath the map, then rose onto his hind legs and placed one paw against the lower right corner, exactly where a faded trail line disappeared near Frostmere Creek. The entire diner went quiet. Rowan stood slowly. Not because he believed in signs. He didn't. War had burned most superstition out of him years ago. But Atlas never reacted without reason. Rowan walked closer. The map was old. Very old. Hand-marked trails crossed portions of Whitlock Timber Ridge, though several had faded almost completely with time. Atlas sniffed hard near the frame itself. That was when Rowan realized it. The frame was cedar, and beneath the smell of old varnish lingered another scent buried deep inside memory. Gun oil. The Elias's gun oil. A cold feeling moved slowly down Rowan's spine. Not fear. Recognition. Then came the voice behind him. "You look just like him." Rowan turned. The old man near the window had risen to his feet. Up close, he looked even older, late 70s maybe. Thin but durable in the way forest men sometimes aged, like trees stripped by many winters but still standing. "Like who?" Rowan asked quietly. The old man studied him another long moment. "Elias Whitlock," he said. especially around the eyes. The name hit Rowan harder than he expected, like a dry branch striking frozen ground. For a second, he was 17 again, standing beside a grave while snow fell across black coats and frozen dirt. Mary Lou glanced between them carefully. "You knew Elias?" she asked Rowan. Rowan hesitated, then nodded once. "He raised me." Something softened immediately in the old woman's face. "Well," she said quietly, "that explains the dog." Rowan frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" But before she could answer, Atlas suddenly growled, low, sharp, focused toward the dark windows. Everyone in the diner turned. Outside, beyond the parking lot, the tree line stood motionless beneath the fading light. Nothing moved. Still, Atlas remained frozen, staring toward the woods. The old man beside Rowan spoke almost under his breath. "Same damn thing Ranger used to do." Rowan's pulse slowed strangely. Ranger. Elias's old German shepherd, dead nearly 25 years now. Atlas took one step toward the door, then stopped. The growl faded, just as suddenly as it started. The tension in the diner broke little by little after that. Coffee cups lifted again. Someone laughed softly near the counter. But Rowan noticed people watching him now in subtle ways. Black Alder was small. Names stayed alive longer than people did, especially the Whitlock name. Later, back at the motel, Rowan sat on the edge of the bed cleaning Atlas's paw carefully beneath the yellow light of an old lamp. The dog watched him quietly. "You smell something out there?" Rowan asked. Atlas blinked once. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant surf. Rowan looked toward the dark forest beyond the motel parking lot. He had spent years avoiding this county, avoiding the roads, the creek, the ridge, the memories. Mostly he avoided the guilt, because part of him still believed he had abandoned Elias by leaving, just like he had abandoned men overseas, just like he had abandoned pieces of himself, one battlefield at a time. Atlas rested his head slowly against Rowan's knee, a simple gesture, heavy with trust. Rowan exhaled quietly and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know something I don't, huh?" Atlas's eyes remained fixed toward the window, toward the woods, toward Whitlock Ridge somewhere beyond the darkness. Long after midnight, Rowan woke suddenly. Years of military conditioning did that to a man. Sometimes it was a sound, sometimes a shift in silence. The motel room was cold. Atlas stood near the window, perfectly still, watching the forest, not barking, not growling, waiting, as if somewhere out there beneath the black pines and autumn mist, something was waiting too. Snow came early the winter Rowan Whitlock lost his mother. Not the soft kind that drifted gently through Christmas postcards. This was mountain snow, heavy, wet, and relentless. It buried fence posts, bent tree limbs, and turned the roads through Black Alder County into pale rivers of ice. Rowan remembered standing beneath the cracked awning outside the county shelter with a trash bag clutched against his chest, watching snow gather on his worn sneakers. He had been 7 years old and small for his age, all sharp elbows and hollow eyes. His dark brown hair hung damp across his forehead, and his cheeks were raw from cold wind and crying he had tried hard not to do in front of strangers. The adult spoke over him instead of to him. That was what he remembered most. The social worker, a tired woman named Denise Harper with short gray curls and a voice worn smooth by difficult years, kept saying words like temporary placement and evaluation period. Rowan did not understand most of it. He only understood that his mother was gone, and nobody seemed certain what to do with him now. Then an old pickup truck rolled into the parking lot through the snow. The engine coughed twice before shutting off. A tall, old man stepped out wearing a canvas coat lined with worn shearling. Snow dusted the shoulders of the coat and melted slowly into the faded brown fabric. He moved stiffly, like someone whose joints had spent decades working against cold weather and heavy lumber. Elias Whitlock. Even at 70-something, Elias carried a quiet physical presence that made people move aside without realizing they were doing it. His face was narrow and weathered, lined deeply around pale blue-gray eyes that missed very little. Thick, calloused hands hung from the sleeves of his coat like roots from an old tree. He walked inside without hurry, without drama. The social worker straightened slightly when she saw him. "Mr. Whitlock?" she said carefully. "We weren't expecting, where's the boy?" Simple as that. No speeches, no sympathy, just purpose. Denise glanced toward Rowan. Elias looked at the child for a long moment. Not with pity, that was important. Even at 7, Rowan understood the difference between pity and recognition. "You know how to stack firewood?" Elias finally asked. Rowan blinked once, then nodded carefully. "Good," Elias said. "Get your things." That was how love arrived in Rowan's life. Not warm, not gentle. Steady. Outside, snow fell harder as Rowan climbed into the passenger seat of the truck. The heater barely worked. A thermos rolled back and forth on the floorboards with every turn. The cab smelled faintly of cedar shavings, old coffee, and chainsaw oil. Elias drove mostly in silence. The forest thickened around them mile by mile until the road narrowed into little more than frozen dirt between towering pines. Black Alder County disappeared behind the storm. Ahead waited Whitlock Ridge. The cabin emerged slowly through the trees near dusk, yellow light glowing from frost-covered windows. Rowan remembered the first thing he heard when Elias opened the truck door. Wind moving through the pines. Not loud, just endless. The cabin itself looked ancient even then. Moss crawled across sections of the roof. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney into the darkening sky. A stack of split firewood leaned beneath one wall beside rusted tools and snow-covered buckets. Inside smelled like black coffee, damp wool, wood smoke, and something warm cooking slowly on the stove. Home, though Rowan would not have known that word yet. Elias pointed toward a small room near the back. "You'll sleep there." That was all. No long explanation, no promise that everything would be all right. But later that night, Rowan noticed Elias had left an extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The old man never mentioned it. The next morning began before sunrise. Whitlock Ridge woke early. Always. Rowan stumbled from bed, half awake, and found Elias already dressed, drinking coffee beside a crackling radio that hissed between weather reports and old country songs. "Boots," Elias grunted. "We've got fence damage near the Lower Creek." The old man handed Rowan a pair of gloves far too large for him. Outside, dawn spread slowly across the forest in silver-blue layers. Snow covered everything except the dark trunks of pine trees and the frozen ribbon of Frostmere Creek cutting through the valley below. That was Rowan's first lesson about the land. Winter never stopped the work. Over the years that followed, Whitlock Ridge shaped Rowan more thoroughly than any school or church ever could. Elias taught without sounding like he was teaching. He showed Rowan how deer moved before storms, how hollow trees sounded different beneath an axe, how to tell healthy soil from dying ground by smell alone. "The forest speaks plain," Elias often said. "People are the ones who complicate things." Sometimes they worked entire days without exchanging 10 words, but Rowan never felt lonely beside him. There were others who came and went from the ridge during those years. Otis Bell visited often. Otis owned the saw repair shop in town, though shop was generous. The building looked ready to collapse most winters. Otis himself resembled an old bear somebody had taught to fix engines. He was short and broad, with thick gray beard stubble permanently stained by cigarette smoke and machine oil. His heavy blue work jacket smelled like gasoline and pine sap year-round. Otis treated Rowan like he belonged there from the start. "That kid swings an axe straighter than half the idiots in this county," he once muttered while sharpening chains beside the barn. Elias only grunted, which for him was practically agreement. Not everyone felt the same. Every Thanksgiving, Caleb Whitlock returned from the city with his wife and expensive coats that looked too clean for black alder weather. Caleb was a large man in his 40s then, broad-shouldered like his father, but softer around the edges. His dark hair had already begun turning gray near the temples. He carried himself like someone permanently halfway between irritation and exhaustion. He wasn't cruel, exactly. That almost made it worse. He spoke politely to Rowan, asked questions, brought gifts sometimes, but there was distance in it. The kind people keep between themselves and something temporary. One winter evening, Rowan overheard Caleb talking quietly in the kitchen while Elias worked outside. "Dad always had a habit of dragging home strays," Caleb muttered. Not angry, just tired. Like a man discussing weather he could no longer change. The words stayed with Rowan long after. Years later, in deserts half a world away, Rowan would still remember them unexpectedly. Strays. That night, Rowan sat alone outside behind the cabin while snow drifted softly through the trees. He was maybe 11 then, skinny beneath layers of oversized flannel and winter coats. A shadow moved quietly beside him. Old Ranger, Elias's German shepherd. Ranger had been large even for a shepherd, gray-faced with age but still powerful through the chest and shoulders. One ear stood upright while the other bent slightly from an old injury nobody explained fully. The dog lowered himself beside Rowan with a grunt and stared silently into the dark woods. "You think he's right?" Rowan whispered. Ranger leaned his weight gently against the boy's shoulder. Warm, solid. At the time, Rowan thought the dog simply liked him. Only years later would he understand what Elias had been doing all along, teaching the boy how loyalty feels. One spring afternoon, when Rowan was 13, Elias took him deep into the northern section of Whitlock Ridge, where the trees grew older and thicker than anywhere else on the property. Ranger walked ahead through shafts of amber sunlight. Suddenly, the old dog stopped, completely still. Not barking, not growling, waiting. Elias froze too. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then Elias quietly removed his hat. Rowan heard it a moment later, the distant ringing of metal somewhere deep beneath the earth. Faint, rhythmic, almost like chains striking stone underground. The sound vanished as quickly as it came. Rowan looked up at Elias. The old man's expression had changed in a way Rowan had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition mixed with something older. "Some places," Elias said quietly, "remember things longer than people should." Then he turned back toward home without another word. For years afterward, Rowan would wonder why Ranger kept glancing back toward those trees the entire walk home. By 16, Rowan could run most of Whitlock Ridge himself. He repaired fences, checked creek levels, maintained generators, stacked winter wood. Elias's knees had worsened by then. Cold mornings hit the old man harder every year, though he rarely complained aloud. One October evening they sat together on the porch while autumn light poured gold across Frostmere Creek below. Ranger slept nearby beneath Elias's chair. "You ever think about leaving?" Rowan asked quietly. Elias sipped coffee before answering. "Everybody leaves eventually." "That's not what I meant." The old man looked out across the forest for a long time. "You can leave land," he finally said. "But if you've walked it honestly long enough, Part of you stays, whether you want it to or not. Rowan remembered those words years later while bleeding in foreign countries beneath different skies. Part of you stays. Maybe that was why coming back to Black Alder hurt so much now. Because some wounded part of him had never actually left. That night in the motel room 20 years later, Atlas slept curled near the heater while Rowan sat awake beside the window watching snow begin to fall lightly through the dark pines outside. The forest looked exactly the same as it had when Elias first drove him home. Patient. Waiting. And somewhere deep beneath the old grief still living inside him, Rowan realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely lost. The night Elias Whitlock died, the snow came sideways. Wind slammed against the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the old window panes, and Frostmere Creek disappeared beneath white darkness somewhere below the ridge. Rowan had spent most of that evening hauling split wood from the shed while Elias sat near the stove listening to the weather radio crackle through static. By then, Rowan was 17 and already looked older than most boys his age. Years of chopping wood, repairing fences, and carrying feed sacks had hardened his body early. He stood taller than Elias now, broad through the shoulders with the same sharp jawline and pale eyes that made older men in town glance twice sometimes. But there was still boyhood in him then. Still something unbroken. Elias had been quieter than usual that evening. Not weak exactly, just distant. The old man sat wrapped in his brown shearling-lined canvas coat despite the heat from the stove, one rough hand resting against the armchair while snow hissed against the roof overhead. "You checked the north generator?" he asked suddenly. "An hour ago." "Fuel?" "Full." Elias nodded once. That was enough conversation for a while. Rowan remembered standing at the kitchen counter later making coffee neither of them really needed. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and cold air leaking beneath the doorframe. Ranger slept near the stove, old muzzle twitching occasionally in dreams. Then came the sound. Not loud, just a heavy object falling upstairs. Rowan froze instantly. So did Ranger. The old dog struggled painfully to his feet before Rowan even reached the staircase. "Elias?" No answer. The second-floor hallway was dark except for weak yellow light spilling from Elias's bedroom. Rowan reached the doorway and stopped breathing for one terrible second. Elias lay collapsed beside the bed. One arm bent beneath him, eyes half open. Snowstorm wind moaned softly outside the windows while Rowan dropped to his knees beside the old man. "Elias?" Nothing. No response. Only the terrible stillness that comes when a body has already begun leaving behind the person inside it. Rowan called emergency services with shaking hands while Ranger paced anxiously nearby, claws scraping across old wooden floors. The ambulance never arrived in time. Roads were too bad, weather too heavy. By dawn, Elias Whitlock was dead. And Whitlock Ridge no longer belonged to the only person who truly understood it. The funeral happened 3 days later beneath iron-gray skies. Half the county showed up. Farmers, mechanics, old loggers, retired forest men wearing weathered jackets that smelled faintly of diesel and pine sap. People stood among snow-covered gravestones, speaking quietly about Elias Whitlock like he had been part of the land itself. Maybe he had. Caleb arrived from Minneapolis the night before the service. Age had sharpened him rather than softened him. At nearly 50, Caleb still carried traces of the strong, rural build he'd inherited from Elias, but city life had polished away the rough edges. His expensive wool coat fit too neatly against his shoulders. His beard was trimmed carefully. Even his boots looked like they had never stepped into real mud. He hugged Rowan awkwardly after the burial. "You holding up all right?" he asked. Rowan nodded automatically. People always asked that question after funerals. Nobody really expected honest answers. The will reading happened in the cabin 2 days later. Rain tapped softly against the windows while wet firewood hissed in the stove. A lawyer named Gerald Pike sat at the kitchen table with a stack of documents arranged neatly before him. Gerald was a thin man in his 60s with sharp cheekbones and steel gray hair combed perfectly backward. He spoke carefully, like someone who had spent his entire life trying not to disturb rooms. Caleb sat across from him. So did Caleb's wife, Marion. Marion Whitlock looked elegant in the coldest possible way. Tall and pale, with dark auburn hair pinned neatly behind one ear, she carried herself like a woman permanently disappointed by the world around her. Her voice was soft, but her eyes measured everything, including Rowan. Gerald adjusted his glasses. The cabin property and primary acreage transferred jointly to Caleb Whitlock and family. Rowan stared at the coffee cup in front of him, not surprised. Not really. The old lawyer continued reading. There were savings accounts, equipment, land boundaries, tax information. Then finally, a small financial provision has been allocated for Rowan Mercer alongside temporary placement assistance until legal adulthood. Placement assistance. The words sat in Rowan's chest like cold nails. Marion glanced down briefly. Caleb looked tired suddenly. Nobody argued. Nobody stopped it. Outside, rain moved through the pines in slow gray sheets while the cabin smelled faintly of burnt coffee and wet wool. Home was ending quietly. Just like that. Later that night, Rowan packed his clothes into black trash bags while Ranger watched from the doorway. The old German Shepherd had grown slower over the years. White fur covered most of his muzzle now, and arthritis stiffened his back legs in cold weather. But his eyes remained steady and intelligent. "You don't get it either, huh?" Rowan muttered softly. Ranger crossed the room slowly and leaned against Rowan's leg, heavy, warm. The dog stayed beside him until morning. 2 weeks later, Rowan left Whitlock Ridge. Ranger died before spring. Rowan learned that from Otis Bell months afterward through a short phone call filled mostly with silence. "He laid down beside Elias's chair one night," Otis said quietly. "Didn't get back up." That hurt worse than Rowan expected, because some part of him understood the truth immediately. Ranger had never really belonged to anyone except Elias. And after Elias was gone, the old dog simply stopped staying. The Army came next, then BUD/S training, then war. Afghanistan smelled nothing like Black Alder County. No pine, no wet earth, no creek water. Only dust, diesel, smoke. By 30, Rowan Mercer had become the kind of man newspapers occasionally wrote about without understanding at all. Decorated Navy SEAL, multiple deployments, tactical specialist. The articles never mentioned insomnia, or panic waking him at 3 a.m., or the way some men slowly stopped believing they deserved peaceful places. The mission that changed everything happened outside Kandahar. Rowan still remembered the heat inside the armored vehicle that day. Sweat soaked through his tactical gloves while radio chatter crackled endlessly through headsets. His closest friend sat beside him, Evan Shaw. Evan was 32, with sandy blonde hair always cut too short and the relaxed grin of a man capable of making people laugh even while cleaning rifles. Lean-built and sharp-eyed, Evan carried photographs of his wife and daughter folded inside his vest pocket through every deployment. He also trusted Rowan completely, which somehow made everything worse afterward. The explosion hit the convoy from beneath. Metal screamed. Dust swallowed everything. Training took over immediately. Gunfire, smoke, chaos. Evan became trapped beneath collapsed steel inside the vehicle while flames spread toward the rear fuel compartment. Rowan tried to reach him, twice. The second attempt nearly killed both of them. Then came the order no one ever forgives themselves for giving. "Pull back!" Even now, Rowan still heard Evan shouting through smoke behind him, still saw the fire blooming bright orange against desert sand. The vehicle exploded 30 seconds later. Afterward, command called Rowan's decision necessary, tactically correct, lives saved. None of it mattered, because Evan still died, calling Rowan's name. Months later, during another deployment, Rowan first met Atlas. The German shepherd stood inside a military kennel under harsh floodlights, silent, while handlers moved around him. Unlike the other dogs barking against their cages, Atlas simply watched, calm, assessing. The canine handler, Sergeant Luis Ortega, noticed Rowan staring. Ortega was a compact man in his 40s with dark skin weathered by desert sun and deep lines around tired brown eyes. He treated military dogs with more patience than most people. "That one's different," Ortega said quietly. "How?" "He listens before he reacts." Atlas approached slowly when Rowan stepped closer. No growling, no nervous pacing. The dog sniffed Rowan's hand once, then suddenly froze. Every muscle locked tight. Atlas turned his head toward the dark ridgeline beyond the base perimeter. 3 seconds later, warning sirens erupted across camp. Incoming mortar fire. Ortega stared at the dog, then at Rowan. That shepherd just heard death before radar did. For the first time in years, Rowan felt something move inside him that wasn't guilt. Trust. Atlas became Rowan's assigned canine 6 months later. The dog saved his life during an ambush near Helmand Province by dragging him clear of a delayed secondary explosion seconds before detonation tore through their vehicle. After that, the two men in Rowan's unit joked there was an invisible rope tied between soldier and dog. Neither ever moved far without the other noticing. When Rowan finally retired years later, the military handed him paperwork, medals, and Atlas. No ceremony could tell a man what to do with himself afterward. So Rowan drifted. Wyoming, Montana, Dakotas, truck stops, temporary jobs, cheap motels. No home lasted long because Rowan never stayed long enough for places to become homes. Until Black Alder. Until Atlas lifted his head in that diner beneath the old county map. Now, sitting alone outside the motel room while cold autumn rain whispered through the trees, Rowan watched Atlas sleeping beside the truck and felt something deeply uncomfortable settling inside his chest. Not fear, not grief. Recognition. Like the forest had noticed, he'd finally come back and was waiting to see whether this time he would leave again. Morning came pale and cold across Black Alder County. Fog drifted low between the pine trunks like wood smoke that had forgotten where it came from. Rowan Whitlock stood outside the motel room with a steaming cup of bitter coffee in one hand, while Atlas sniffed along the edge of the parking lot. The German shepherd had been restless since dawn, not anxious, focused. There was a difference. Atlas moved with deliberate purpose now, nose low to the ground, pausing every few yards as if reconnecting invisible threads Rowan could not see. The dog's black and tan coat glistened faintly with dew beneath the weak morning sun. His ears twitched constantly toward sounds too distant for human hearing. Rowan watched him carefully. "You planning to drag me halfway across the county today?" Atlas glanced back once, then continued toward the truck. That answer was clear enough. An hour later, they were driving north along a narrow forest road winding toward Whitlock Ridge. Gravel snapped beneath the tires while towering pines closed overhead like cathedral beams. Black Alder County looked beautiful in autumn. That almost made it dangerous. Beautiful places could fool people into believing they were gentle. The ranger station appeared near a fork in the road, tucked beside a creek lined with moss-covered stones. A faded government sign leaned slightly sideways near the entrance. Black Alder Forest Service. A woman stood outside loading equipment into the back of a green utility vehicle. Clara Bellamy looked exactly like someone raised by northern forests. Tall and athletic without trying to appear strong, she moved with the quiet balance of a person accustomed to uneven ground and bad weather. Her dark forest green ranger jacket hung open over a gray turtleneck sweater, and strands of brown blonde hair escaped the loose tie at the back of her neck whenever wind pushed through the trees. Freckles dusted the bridge of her nose. Her hazel eyes missed almost nothing. She looked toward Rowan's truck before he fully parked, then her gaze shifted to Atlas. "Military dog?" she asked. Her voice carried the calm directness of someone used to speaking around chainsaws and storms. "Canine," Rowan answered as he stepped out. "Retired." Atlas remained beside the truck, watching Clara carefully but without aggression. Good sign. Clara crouched slightly, studying the shepherd. "He's favoring the left leg." That said ligament strain. "He'll ignore it until it becomes worse." Rowan gave the faintest smile. "So would I." That almost earned a smile from her, too. Almost. Then her attention sharpened when Rowan introduced himself. "Whitlock," she repeated quietly. Not surprised. More like something inside her had shifted unexpectedly. "You knew Elias?" Rowan nodded once. "He raised me." For several seconds, Clara said nothing. Wind moved softly through nearby pines while creek water whispered over stone behind them. Finally, she looked away toward the forest. "My father disappeared in those woods 15 years ago," she said. "Winter storm. Search teams never found him." Her expression stayed controlled, but Rowan recognized grief buried beneath discipline. Soldiers learned to spot that kind of thing in each other. "Elias found him 3 days later," Clara continued quietly. "Brought him home himself." She looked back toward Rowan. "Most people here respected the forest. Elias understood it." That sentence stayed with Rowan. Understood it. Not owned, not conquered. Understood. Clara agreed to show Rowan the current survey boundaries around Whitlock Ridge after learning Northern Crown Resources had begun marking roads nearby. "Damian Voss wants new access routes before winter closes the upper ridge," she explained while driving ahead in the ranger vehicle. "County approved preliminary permits last month." Rowan stared through the windshield. "Without talking to locals first?" Clara gave a dry laugh. "Welcome back to Black Alder." The deeper they traveled into Whitlock Ridge, the stranger Atlas became. The dog moved ahead constantly, pulling toward old paths almost erased beneath moss and fallen needles. He paused beside certain trees, sniffed weathered fence posts, then continued with growing certainty. It wasn't random. Rowan knew that much. Atlas was following scent memory. Old leather, gun oil, metal. Elias. The ridge itself felt frozen in time. Old wooden bridges sagged over narrow creeks. Ancient pines towered overhead. Rusting trail markers leaned crooked among ferns and stone. At one point, Atlas stopped beside a massive cedar stump blackened by lightning years earlier. He sniffed intensely at the exposed roots, then moved on. Clara noticed Rowan watching him. "He's tracking something." "Yeah." "What?" Rowan looked deeper into the forest ahead. "I'm starting to think I don't know." By afternoon, clouds rolled heavily across the mountains. Rain began soon after. Cold, steady, relentless. They took shelter inside an abandoned fire lookout cabin near the upper ridge while weather hammered against the roof overhead. The cabin smelled like wet timber and old smoke. Dust covered most surfaces. Someone had left rusted tools hanging near the door decades ago. Atlas paced restlessly. Not nervous. Thinking. Rowan sat near the window while Clara unfolded maps across a rough wooden table. "Northern Crown survey lines don't make sense," she said quietly. "They're cutting too far east." "Toward Frostmere?" She nodded. "That creek matters more than people think." Before Rowan could ask what she meant, headlights appeared through the rain outside. A black SUV rolled slowly into view beside the cabin. Expensive. Clean. Out of place. The driver stepped out holding an umbrella against the storm. Damien Voss. Even from a distance, the man looked controlled in a way Rowan instantly distrusted. Tall and lean, Damien carried himself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms already expecting ownership. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly, despite the weather, and silver streaks touched the dark hair near his temples. No wasted movement, no visible discomfort. Only calculation. "Ranger Bellamy," Damien called politely while approaching the cabin. "Didn't expect company up here." His eyes shifted toward Rowan, then Atlas. The dog immediately stepped between Rowan and the doorway, still silent. Damien noticed that too. "Interesting." "I know who you are," Damien said after a moment. Rowan's expression hardened slightly. "Do you?" "Elias Whitlock's boy." "Not your son, not your heir, your boy." Subtle difference. Damien removed rainwater carefully from his gloves before continuing. "Your grandfather owned beautiful land," he said. "Would have hated seeing it sit unused." Rowan felt something cold move through his chest. Forests aren't unused just because somebody isn't making money off them. Damien studied him carefully, then smiled faintly. "You sound exactly like Elias." That wasn't meant kindly. The rain intensified outside. Atlas never stopped watching Damien. Eventually, the CEO left with polite nods and expensive headlights disappearing through dark trees. But the cabin felt different afterward, like something unwelcome had crossed a threshold. That night the storm worsened. Rain slammed through Whitlock Ridge hard enough to shake the old cabin walls. Rowan woke sometime after midnight to find Atlas gone. The door hung partly open. Cold wind rushed inside. "Atlas!" No answer. Rowan grabbed his flashlight and pushed into the storm. Rain soaked through his olive field jacket almost instantly while thunder rolled across the mountains above. Then he saw movement uphill. Atlas stood beneath a towering pine split nearly in half by an old lightning strike. The tree looked ancient and wounded, one side dead and blackened while the other still lived. The dog was digging frantically beneath the roots. Mud sprayed backward beneath powerful paws. "Atlas!" The shepherd ignored him completely. Then Rowan's flashlight caught metal beneath the dirt. A rusted lockbox, half buried beneath the tree. Atlas stopped digging and looked directly at Rowan. Not proud, not excited. Certain, as if he had finally found the thing he'd been searching for all along. Back inside the cabin, Rowan cleaned mud from the lockbox carefully while rain rattled against the windows. Clara watched silently beside him. The metal box was old military green, edges worn smooth by decades underground. Rowan recognized the leather strap wrapped around it immediately. Elias's. His hands tightened slightly. For one strange second, he could almost smell the old cabin again. Coffee, cedar smoke, winter air. Inside the box lay several waterproof document packets, a faded photograph, and an envelope addressed simply, "For the boy who comes back." Rowan stared at the handwriting for a long moment before opening it. The photograph showed him at maybe 8 years old, standing beside Elias near Frostmere Creek. Ranger sat proudly at their feet beneath bright autumn leaves. Rowan barely recognized the child he used to be. The letter underneath was shorter than expected. If the boy comes back, the dog will know the way. Trust what the land remembers. E.W. Clara slowly exhaled beside him. What exactly did your grandfather bury out here? Rowan looked down at the sealed survey packets resting inside the box. Outside, thunder rolled through Whitlock Ridge while Atlas settled quietly near the door at last, eyes half closed but alert. For the first time since returning to Black Alder County, Rowan understood something clearly. Elias had never expected him to stay gone forever. The old man had been waiting, patient as the forest itself. Rain lingered over Black Alder County for 3 straight days after Rowan found the lockbox. The mountains disappeared behind low gray clouds, and Frostmere Creek swelled dark and fast beneath the pines. Water dripped constantly from cabin roofs, branches, and rusted fence wire, creating the strange feeling that the entire forest was quietly breathing around them. Rowan barely slept, not because of fear, because of the documents. The papers inside Elias's lockbox now sat spread across the old ranger station table beneath yellow overhead lights. Some pages were faded nearly brown with age. Others remained sealed in waterproof sleeves marked with county filing numbers and official stamps. Atlas lay nearby beside the wood stove, head resting across his paws, watching every movement in the room with steady concentration. Clara stood across from Rowan, holding one of the survey maps carefully between both hands. "This isn't just property paperwork," she said quietly. Rowan looked up. Clara's calm ranger composure had shifted slightly during the last hour. Not panic, not excitement, something more serious. Respect. The map stretched across almost the entirety of Whitlock Ridge. Elias's handwritten notes filled the margins in tight, deliberate script. Water movement, underground pressure, protected spring routes, old survey coordinates. Every inch of the land had been studied, watched, understood. "He spent years on this," Clara murmured. Rowan nodded once. "That sounds like him." A truck engine growled outside. A few moments later, the ranger station door opened, letting in cold, damp air and the smell of wet pine. The man entering removed his hat carefully before stepping fully inside. Henry Vale, county attorney. Late 60s, tall and narrow through the shoulders. Sharp nose, silver mustache trimmed with almost military precision. He looked like the kind of man who ironed flannel shirts before wearing them. Even his dark wool coat seemed too orderly for Black Alder weather. But his eyes softened immediately when they landed on Rowan. "You've got Elias's stare," Henry said quietly. Apparently everyone in this county carried the same ghost. Henry had handled legal work around Black Alder for 40 years. Land disputes, timber contracts, old mineral claims. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, like a man who understood careless words could ruin families for generations. He spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the documents in silence. The only sounds in the room were pages turning, rain tapping windows, Atlas breathing beside the stove. Finally, Henry removed his glasses. "Well," he said softly, "your grandfather buried a war chest." Clara crossed her arms. "How bad?" Henry looked toward Rowan. "Not bad for you." He tapped the largest survey packet carefully. Elias Whitlock transferred the majority of Whitlock Ridge into a protected land trust 17 years ago. The words settled heavily into the room. Rowan said nothing. Henry continued. "The trust activates fully upon confirmation of your identity and return to county jurisdiction." He paused briefly. "Meaning the land was never Caleb's to inherit." Rain hammered harder outside. Clara sat slowly at the table. "You're saying Elias planned all this before he died?" "Oh, he planned it thoroughly," Henry replied. The old attorney almost sounded impressed. He opened another folder. "The water rights alone are extraordinary." That finally got Rowan's attention. Henry spread several geological surveys across the table. Underneath Whitlock Ridge ran an enormous underground mineral spring system connected to Frostmere Creek through natural limestone filtration deep beneath the mountains. Not oil, not gold. Water. Clean enough to bottle commercially. Rare enough to become enormously valuable within the next decade. Henry adjusted his glasses again. Northern Crown isn't interested in timber, he explained. Trees are temporary money. Water isn't. Clara leaned forward slightly. That's why they're pushing roads toward the East Ridge. Henry nodded. The spring access points begin there. Rowan stared down at the maps silently. All those years, Elias had known. Not just about the forest, about the future. He filed environmental protections too, Henry added. Restricted extraction permits, protected creek boundaries, usage limitations. Clara looked stunned. He built legal walls around the entire watershed. Yes, Henry said quietly. And he hid those walls well. Rowan slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since returning to Black Alder County, he truly understood the scale of what Elias had done. The old man hadn't simply protected land. He had protected time, protected the future, protected Rowan. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, instantly alert. The dog stood and moved toward the window. Rowan noticed the change immediately. What is it? Atlas stared toward the tree line beyond the ranger station parking lot, focused. Listening. Then came headlights. A white survey truck rolled slowly through the rain and stopped beside the road. Two men stepped out carrying equipment cases. Northern Crown survey crew. One of them glanced toward the ranger station windows before quickly looking away. The second man began speaking quietly while pointing toward the eastern ridgeline map mounted inside their truck. Atlas gave a low growl. Not loud, certain. Rowan watched carefully. Something about the men's body language felt wrong. Too nervous. Too hurried. Henry followed Rowan's gaze. They shouldn't be surveying during active weather warnings. Clara's jaw tightened slightly. That's because they know county inspectors won't be out tonight. Without another word, Rowan grabbed his jacket. The rain had almost stopped by the time Rowan and Atlas reached the eastern boundary line an hour later. Mist drifted through the forest in pale ribbons beneath flashlight beams. The survey markers Northern Crown placed earlier that week stood bright orange against the dark trees. Atlas moved ahead suddenly, fast. The shepherd stopped near a cluster of moss-covered stones beside the creek bank and began pawing furiously at wet leaves. Rowan knelt beside him. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then his flashlight caught fresh dirt. Someone had dug here recently. Very recently. Rowan pulled aside the leaves and uncovered an iron boundary spike buried crookedly beneath the mud. Not old. Newly moved. Clara crouched beside him, rainwater dripping from her ranger cap. Oh my God. The survey marker had been relocated nearly 30 feet west, just enough to push Northern Crown's proposed road deeper into protected trust land. Atlas looked back at Rowan silently, chest rising hard from exertion. Not triumphant, not excited, just watchful, like he already knew this mattered. Back at the ranger station, Henry photographed everything carefully while Clara filed emergency documentation with county records. This changes things, she said. Henry nodded grimly. It proves intent. Rowan stood near the window watching rain slide down the glass. Northern Crown's desperate, he muttered. Henry closed the evidence folder. No, he corrected softly. They're early. That sentence stayed with Rowan because it sounded exactly like something Elias would have said. Not emotional, not dramatic. Precise. The old attorney eventually packed his documents carefully into a leather briefcase worn smooth with age. Before leaving, he paused beside Rowan. "There's one more thing," Henry said quietly. "What?" Henry hesitated. "Elias amended the trust 3 months before he died." Rowan frowned slightly. "Why?" The attorney studied him carefully before answering. "He changed the beneficiary name." Silence settled across the room. Even Atlas looked up. "It originally listed Rowan Mercer," Henry continued softly, "but the amended filing changed it to Rowan Whitlock." The air seemed to leave Rowan's lungs all at once. He stared at Henry without speaking. "I thought you should know," the attorney said gently. Then he left. Outside, darkness settled fully across Black Alder County. Clara remained by the stove pretending to organize paperwork while quietly giving Rowan space. Atlas crossed the room slowly and sat beside him. Rowan rested one rough hand against the shepherd's neck. Whitlock, not Mercer, not the county shelter name, not the military records, not the drifting years afterward. Whitlock. The forest outside moved softly beneath rising wind. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then Clara finally asked the question, hanging silently in the room. "What are you going to do now?" Rowan looked toward the black pine ridges beyond the window, toward the land Elias had spent nearly 20 years protecting in secret, toward the place he had once believed abandoned him. Atlas leaned slightly against his leg, solid, present. Home felt dangerous to Rowan, because once a man admitted he belonged somewhere, he also admitted how much it could hurt to lose it. And for the first time since returning to Black Alder County, Rowan realized he was no longer afraid of leaving. He was afraid of staying. The county administration building in Black Alder looked older every year. Rain stains darkened the stone beneath the windows, and the narrow hallways smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and wet paper. The building had once been a courthouse before the county lost enough population to stop pretending it needed one. Now it served as everything at once: records office, legal chamber, permit department, and the slow-beating bureaucratic heart of a dying timber county. Rowan Whitlock stood near one of the tall windows overlooking Main Street while Atlas rested beside him. The German shepherd remained unusually alert that morning, not tense, protective. His amber-brown eyes tracked every movement entering the room with calm precision. Across the conference table, Damien Voss sat perfectly composed in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than most trucks parked outside the building. His dark hair was neatly combed despite the damp weather, silver streaks near the temples giving him the polished appearance of a man who had learned long ago how to turn age into authority rather than weakness. Beside Damien sat Northern Crown's legal representative, Martin Kessler, mid-50s, lean, sharp-featured. He had the dry, bloodless look of a man who spent most of his life inside offices lit by fluorescent lights. His narrow tie sat perfectly centered beneath a dark navy suit, and he spoke with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to winning arguments through exhaustion rather than truth. Clara Bellamy sat beside Rowan with a thick stack of survey records in front of her. Henry Vale organized trust documents carefully near the end of the table, while county officials shifted uneasily in their chairs. Nobody in Black Alder liked conflict with corporations. Corporations stayed, or left, but they always took something first. Caleb Whitlock arrived last. He looked older than Rowan remembered, not physically, tired older. His brown work jacket hung damp from the rain outside, and deep shadows sat beneath his eyes like sleeplessness had become permanent. The carefully controlled businessman from Minneapolis seemed thinner somehow now that he stood back inside Black Alder County. For a moment, he simply looked at Rowan. Neither spoke. Then Caleb quietly took his seat. The meeting began with paperwork. Always paperwork first. Henry Vale presented the trust documents slowly and methodically. Every environmental filing Elias Whitlock had recorded, every water protection clause, every preservation restriction tied to Frostmere Creek and Whitlock Ridge. The deeper Henry went, the quieter the room became. Damien Voss listened without interruption. Only his eyes moved, calculating. Martin Kessler occasionally scribbled notes with quick, irritated motions. When Henry finally placed Elias's handwritten survey notes onto the table, even the county commissioners leaned closer. The old pages carried decades of observations, water pressure readings, seasonal flow changes, underground filtration paths, ecological impact estimates. Elias had documented the land the way priests once copied scripture, patiently, completely. He knew exactly what Northern Crown would eventually try to do, Clara said quietly. Damien folded his hands together. Mr. Whitlock anticipated economic growth, he replied calmly. That doesn't make development immoral. No, Rowan answered from across the table. Just expensive for everyone except you. The room tightened slightly. Damien turned toward him fully for the first time. You've spent most of your life outside Blackalder, haven't you? Yes, and yet suddenly you want to preserve it. Rowan's jaw shifted faintly. I never stopped wanting that. Something unreadable passed briefly through Damien's expression. Not mockery. Recognition, maybe? Because Damien Voss understood attachment too well to dismiss it casually. He simply valued different things. We're offering partnership, Damien said. Road access agreements, revenue sharing, infrastructure improvements, jobs. Temporary jobs, Clara corrected. Damien ignored her. This county is dying, he continued evenly. Young people leave because there's nothing here. Elias Whitlock preserved thousands of acres for sentiment, while the town around him slowly collapsed. Caleb finally spoke then, quietly. He wasn't sentimental. Everyone looked at him. Caleb stared at the table while speaking. My father didn't do things emotionally. The sentence hung strangely in the room, because everyone there knew it was true. Henry slid another document forward. Mr. Whitlock also filed permanent groundwater protection restrictions under federal conservation statutes, he explained. Martin Kessler frowned sharply. That level of filing requires extensive review. It received extensive review, Henry replied calmly. 21 years ago. For the first time all morning, Damien Voss leaned back slowly in his chair, not defeated, impressed. Your grandfather was thorough, he admitted. Rowan almost smiled at that. Thorough. Yes, that was Elias Whitlock, exactly. Midway through the meeting, Martin Kessler finally lost patience. The lawyer adjusted his glasses sharply before speaking in a voice too polished to hide contempt. With respect, he said, Northern Crown has concerns regarding decision-making stability here. Henry's expression hardened instantly. What exactly does that mean? Kessler glanced briefly toward Rowan. Mr. Whitlock is a decorated veteran with documented combat trauma. We simply question whether emotional attachment and unresolved psychological strain are influencing these negotiations. Silence, cold and immediate. Clara's chair scraped softly against the floor. Caleb stared upward slowly. Rowan felt the old, familiar tightening inside his chest, the one war left behind. Not rage, something heavier. Shame trained into muscle memory. Then Atlas stood. The German shepherd moved silently between Rowan and the conference table. No barking, no growling. He simply planted himself there like stone. Still, steady. A living wall. The room went completely quiet. Atlas's eyes never left Martin Kessler. Not threatening. Warning. Even Damien Voss stopped moving. And for one strange, suspended moment, everyone in the room understood the same thing at once. Whatever damage war had done to Rowan Whitlock, this dog trusted him completely. That mattered, more than anyone wanted to admit. Kessler cleared his throat awkwardly and looked away first. The meeting never fully recovered after that. Northern Crown shifted strategy from pressure toward negotiation. Damien requested additional review periods and proposed temporary suspension of Eastern survey activity pending county evaluation. Not surrender, but retreat. Small, measured, enough to matter. By late afternoon, the meeting finally ended beneath gray skies and cold rain tapping softly against courthouse windows. People left quietly. County officials, lawyers, assistants. Eventually, only Rowan, Caleb, and Atlas remained near the nearly empty records room. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Caleb looked toward the old hallway leading deeper into county storage. Is the cabin still standing? Rowan hesitated slightly. Yeah. Caleb nodded once. Mind if I see it? The drive to Whitlock Ridge happened mostly in silence. Rain had stopped by then, leaving the forest washed clean beneath weak evening sunlight. Atlas slept in the back seat while old roads wound upward through pine shadow and fog. When the cabin finally appeared between the trees, Caleb stopped walking for a moment, like someone seeing a childhood memory preserved too perfectly. Nothing had changed much. The moss-covered roof, the crooked chimney, the woodpile leaning beside the shed. Time moved slower here. Inside, dust floated softly through fading light. Caleb wandered quietly through the rooms while Rowan stayed near the doorway, giving him space. Then Caleb stopped beside the kitchen wall. The height marks, small pencil lines climbing upward year after year. Rowan, age 8, age 10, age 12. Caleb stared at them a long time. Near the staircase still hung an old winter coat Rowan had worn as a child. Elias had apparently never thrown it away. Beside the stove sat a faded photograph. Young Rowan splitting firewood beside Elias while old Ranger watched proudly nearby. Caleb lowered himself slowly into Elias's wooden chair. The old floor creaked beneath his weight. For a while he simply sat there looking around the room. Then finally, I thought he replaced us. The words came out rougher than Rowan expected. Not bitter, broken. Rowan said nothing. Caleb rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. When I was 19, he said quietly, I wanted to stay here. Outside, wind moved gently through the pines. But I watched my father work himself half to death every winter just to hold on to this place. Caleb laughed once without humor. I was scared that if I stayed, this would become my whole life too. He looked toward the window. So I left before the land could keep me. Rowan understood that fear more than he wanted to admit. Caleb's eyes drifted back toward the wall markings again. He loved you differently, he whispered. Not more, just differently. Atlas crossed the room slowly then and rested beside Caleb's chair without hesitation. That seemed to affect Caleb more than anything else had. The older man reached down carefully, almost uncertain, and touched the shepherd's neck. Atlas accepted it calmly. Family. Simple as that. Darkness settled slowly across Whitlock Ridge outside the cabin windows. For the first time in over 20 years, Rowan and Caleb remained inside the same room without resentment standing between them like another person. Not healed, not fixed, but quieter. And somewhere deep in the surrounding forest, Frostmere Creek continued moving patiently beneath the earth Elias Whitlock had spent a lifetime protecting, waiting to see who would stay. Winter came and went over Whitlock Ridge the way it always had, patiently. Snow buried the north trails in January. Frostmere Creek froze along its edges in February. Then spring returned slowly through the pines, carrying meltwater and birdsong back into Black Alder County, one careful inch at a time. And Rowan Whitlock stayed. At first, people in town treated it like a temporary thing. Veterans drifted, outsiders passed through. Men with haunted eyes usually kept driving eventually. But Rowan remained through mud season and thaw season and the long green summer when the mountains smelled of warm pine sap and rain-soaked earth. Whitlock Ridge changed too. Not dramatically. Elias would have hated dramatic changes. The eastern watershed became federally protected conservation land under the trust Elias had built decades earlier. Certain lower sections of forest were leased carefully under strict environmental restrictions negotiated through Henry Vale and county oversight. Enough money came in to stabilize the land, not enough to destroy it. That mattered to Rowan. So did the other thing. The canine program started quietly. No press conference, no speeches. Just an old equipment building near the lower pasture converted into a rehabilitation and training center for retired military dogs and displaced teenagers from county foster systems. Kids who had nowhere stable to go. Dogs too trained for ordinary homes. Somehow, Rowan understood both groups instinctively. Clara joked once that Whitlock Ridge had become a halfway house for stubborn creatures nobody else knew what to do with. Rowan answered, "Sounds about right." The first teenager to arrive was a 15-year-old boy named Levi Grant. Levi looked permanently prepared to run away. Thin beneath oversized hoodies, sharp-faced, pale-skinned, with nervous brown eyes that rarely held contact longer than a second or two. His black hair fell unevenly across his forehead because he'd apparently been cutting it himself with pocket scissors for years. County records described him as difficult. What Rowan saw instead was vigilance, the kind children learned when adults stopped feeling safe. Levi barely spoke his first week at Whitlock Ridge, but Atlas liked him immediately. That surprised everyone. The old German Shepherd had slowed with age during the last year. Gray now touched the fur around his muzzle and eyes. Cold mornings stiffened his back legs sometimes, and he no longer bounded across trails the way he once had. But his eyes remained sharp. Wise, almost. Atlas began following Levi quietly around the property within days. Not crowding him, just staying nearby while the boy repaired fence posts or carried feed buckets awkwardly across muddy ground. One evening, Rowan found Levi sitting beside Atlas near Frostmere Creek while autumn light poured gold through the trees. "He listens without staring at me," Levi muttered quietly while scratching behind the shepherd's ears. Atlas closed his eyes halfway beneath the touch. Rowan leaned against the fence nearby. Dogs notice things people miss. Levi nodded slowly. "Yeah," he whispered. "Guess they do." Life settled into rhythm after that, real rhythm, not survival. Rowan built a smaller cabin higher along the ridge overlooking Frostmere Creek with Clara's help during the late spring. They worked side by side for weeks beneath long northern sunsets, measuring beams, hauling timber, setting foundation posts into rocky soil. Clara Bellamy looked happiest outdoors with dirt on her gloves and sawdust clinging to her ranger jacket. Her freckles darkened during summer months, and loose strands of brown blonde hair constantly escaped the tie at the back of her neck while she worked. She laughed more now, too, not loudly, but genuinely. Sometimes Rowan caught himself listening for it. The cabin itself stayed simple. Wide porch, wood stove, big windows facing the creek valley. Nothing fancy, just solid. The kind of place built to outlast excuses. Atlas claimed the porch almost immediately. Most afternoons, the old shepherd stretched beneath cold northern sunlight, watching hawks circle high above Whitlock Ridge while creek water moved softly below. Peace looked strange on him at first, like armor slowly being removed. Maybe Rowan understood that feeling too well. One windy October afternoon, Clara drove into town searching through old county archives for additional water rights filings connected to Elias Whitlock. The archive basement smelled exactly like forgotten history. Dust, cold paper, old wood polish. Boxes filled narrow aisles beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Margaret Holloway supervised the records room. Margaret was nearly 80, tiny and sharp-eyed, with silver hair pinned tightly behind her head and thin glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She moved slowly now because of arthritis, but her memory remained frighteningly precise. "You're Elias's ranger girl," she said when Clara entered. Clara smiled faintly. "Something like that." Hours later, buried inside a misfiled county registrar box, Clara found one final document. Not land records, not legal surveys. A name change application. Half completed. Her breath caught immediately. The handwriting belonged to Elias. Every line written carefully in blue ink. Rowan Whitlock. The signature line for Rowan himself remained blank. Elias had prepared the papers years earlier, but never forced the boy to sign them. At the bottom of the page, beneath official filing notes, sat one final handwritten sentence. "For the one who stayed, and the dog who brought him home." Clara stared at the words for a very long time while cold archive lights hummed softly overhead. For some reason, she suddenly understood something painful and beautiful at once. Elias had never been trying to claim Rowan. He had simply been waiting for Rowan to claim himself. The first frost arrived 2 weeks later. Morning sunlight spilled pale gold through the pines, while thin ice glazed puddles along the dirt road leading toward Whitlock Ridge. Rowan stood beside the old mailbox near the property entrance, holding a paintbrush in one hand. The mailbox itself had belonged to Elias once. Rust covered parts of the metal despite Levi's best efforts sanding it smooth the day before. Atlas lay nearby in cold autumn sunlight, watching. Always watching. The old shepherd looked peaceful now in ways Rowan had never seen during their military years. Age had softened some sharpness around his movements, but deepened something gentler underneath. Trust, maybe. Belonging. Rowan dipped the brush carefully into black paint, then slowly wrote one word across the mailbox side. Whitlock. The letters looked strange at first. Heavy. Real. He stepped back quietly. For several seconds he simply stared at the name. Not Mercer, not Sergeant, not Drifter. Whitlock. Wind moved through the forest in long honey-colored waves beneath bright October light. A pickup truck approached slowly along the dirt road. Old blue Ford. County plates. The driver lowered his window while passing. Walter Green. Retired logger, late 70s, broad-faced with heavy white mustache and skin permanently weathered by decades outdoors. Walter had known Elias most of his life. He glanced toward the mailbox once, then toward Rowan. "Morning, Mr. Whitlock." Simple words, casual almost. But something inside Rowan stopped moving for one strange, suspended moment. Because there was no pity in Walter's voice, no hesitation, no obligation, just truth. Walter drove on. The sound of the truck faded slowly into the trees. Rowan stood there motionless while cold sunlight touched the ridge around him. Behind him, Atlas shifted once in the grass, breathing slow and steady beneath the autumn sky. Far away, hawks circled above the forest Elias Whitlock had spent his life protecting. The land had carried Rowan's name quietly for years, patiently, waiting for him to become brave enough to return and carry it himself. This time, he stayed. Sometimes God does not answer our prayers with thunder or miracles that shake the sky. Sometimes he answers quietly, through a man who keeps a place at the table for a forgotten child, through a dog that refuses to leave someone behind, through a piece of land that remembers a name long after the world has forgotten it. Most people spend their lives searching for proof that they matter. But maybe grace has never been about becoming important. Maybe it is about being seen fully and still being loved enough to be guided home. Rowan believed he was abandoned. Atlas only followed what the heart already knew. And somewhere through all those silent years, God was still writing a road back for both of them. Maybe there is something in your life right now that feels lost. Maybe you feel forgotten, unwanted, tired, or unseen. But this story is a reminder that heaven often works slowly, patiently, through ordinary things, through kindness, through loyalty, through the people and places that refuse to give up on us. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding treasure. It is discovering that your name was carried with love the entire time. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories about loyalty, healing, faith, and second chances still matter in this world, subscribe to Hollow Point K9 and walk these roads with us again. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps through every dark season, and remind you that no good soul is ever truly forgotten.